Today on Hoopty Doodle, we build some rear axle adjusters / chain adjusters, plus bonus, a rear brake caliper support bracket.
Today I'm going to work on making some chain tensioners for the rear wheel here. You could also call them axle adjusters. Basically on the rear wheel here, we've got some space between the actual wheel and the frame, and I'm going to utilize that to make some spacers to fill up this space so we can space the wheel correctly and center it in the frame. And also I'm going to double feature those spacers and use them to also be chain tensioners. Basically weld a little bolt onto them and we can pull them back and tension the chain. Kind of exactly like the stock ones. So if you look at the stock chain tensioners here, pull that out. That's all it is a little bolt welded onto a spacer, basically. I'm going to do the same thing. So first step, I'm going to make some of these spacers. And that again is going to involve this little lathe here. But first we're going to come over here and I've got some 1-inch round bar. Alright, so the way I'm figuring out how wide these spacers need to be is basically I'm pushing this wheel all the way over to the one side. I'm measuring this distance here and then dividing that in half. Alrighty, now I'm going to go ahead and move this guy. We'll rearrange some things here. Pull this guy out a little bit, and then we're going to come in here and we're going to scribe a line and mark where we want to cut this thing. Alright, and finally, here are our two little spacers. I'm going to go ahead and try and put just these on the bike and see if we're correct in our measurements. Might have something. Alright, so you should be able to see the spacer in there to the left by the frame. And then on the other side, got the same spacer. And man, it seems to fit in there. Alright, now you can see how this slides back and forth like that within the axle plate and that little slot that we made. And so I need something to pull that thing back. See our slot, that we need to be able to adjust that back when necessary to tension the chain. And so I'd like to have it on the inside here because it would just be cleaner. Make the outside where you actually see it, you won't see anything. So you can kind of see that this thing currently, it doesn't quite line up. You see how it's way close to the edge right there. So I'm going to need this thing to come in. There's space for a piece of plate like right on the end here. So I'm going to cut out a piece of that. I'm going to drill and tap it. And then I'm going to weld it onto the end here. All I need to do, I don't need to tap that. I just need to drill that piece of 3/8 so that this will slide in there. And then on the end we'll have some nuts. And that is what will tighten this thing down and pull it back and out. Alright, so I've got this piece of 3/8 here. It's like 1 inch wide and I'm going to drill a nice little hole here. So we need to mark this in a uniform way of where we want to drill them. So I'm going to use my center punch. Alright, then let's get the business drilling. Alright, now let's see, does the rod fit through there? Nice. Figure out where my line is according to that nut. That's really close. So it needs to be at least that close. Let's see how this works. Down on the bike here. I get this thing in here like that. Yeah, that's about it. It's about where I want to be to make this work. So let's try it, man. I need to refine this here little piece, or little block. Alright, so here's my bracket thing on the end of this threaded rod. That's going to go on here, and the threaded rod's going to go up to the spacer. So I think my next step is sort of to drill a hole or something in the spacer so that I can kind of get this threaded rod centered in there or something. So then we can tack this thing onto the actual spacer, weld the threaded rod onto the spacer, and then line all this stuff up and weld this little bracket on. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and remove the axle out of here so I get the spacers out, etc., or at least get this one spacer out of here. All right, so there's that guy. So now the wheel is like solidly in there, and we've done a surprisingly good job. I'm surprising myself on this, so I think this looks pretty cool. It's gonna have some refinement from here on, but at this point I've trimmed off there. It's more than it probably needs, and to make it trimmed off more at some point in the future. But man, our wheel is in there. Nice. So now it's time to figure out the rear brake. So we got the rear brake caliper right here. We got to tie this thing down to the frame somehow so it doesn't rotate on the rotor like that, right? And the stock one, believe it or not, uses this little block. So it's just this block right here. It's this little rectangle. You can kind of get a better view of it right there. On the stock frame, which is over here still, you can see that rectangle fits into this little sort of C-channel thing, slot. I'm gonna just make up another little C-channel piece like that and weld that onto my frame. All right, so the gap that we're dealing with here between the frame, the inside of the frame, and sort of where we want it to land on this caliper mount, it's a little less than 1 inch. All right, so to do that, I'm starting off, I've got some 1-inch angle iron. I'm gonna cut a little piece of this guy, and that'll give me half of my design there. The one in the stock frame, this thing is like 2.5 inches. So now that we've got our little C-channel thing, we should be able to go over here, stick this on the caliper support, rotate this thing down, and then sort of bring this in and weld it to the frame, like right about there. All right, so I'll have to go ahead and take the wheel apart and fully weld up a lot of this stuff. The guy in the back here still needs welding. This guy here is gonna need some more welding. But right now everything's sort of tacked in there pretty strongly. And you can kind of see how this is. There's a little bit of play in there on purpose. I'm going by the stock one, had some play in there. And then there's also going to be paint and everything to account for as well. So we want this thing to still be able to fit in there. But that's it. That's basically how it's going to look. That's where the caliper is going to be positioned on the bike. And hopefully everything works out that way. So that's it. That is the story of the rear wheel of this Honda Grom chopper thing. So everything's sort of buttoned up back here, I think, at this point. There, of course, will be further stuff in the future. This guy, I think I'd like to move this thing down a little bit so it's closer to the wheel. Kind of like this one is down here, is closer to the wheel. There's not as much of a gap there because there'll be like a fender mount possibly at some point that goes on here like that. Mounts onto the fender, and the fender will go over like so, something like that. That's pretty much it for the rear wheel, the rear axle, and all this stuff going on in the rear axle. So thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.